This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and it's Monday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least, that's normally what I do in this series. Every now and then I also like to look at the opposite end of the spectrum, the absolute worst cards in the history of Magic, and that's what I'm doing today with a look at the worst Izzet cards in the history of the game. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have an Izzet identity. A card has an Izzet identity as long as it has both the blue and red mana symbol appear somewhere on the card without any other colored mana symbols. This means a card can simply just cost both Izzet colors, but a card can also have an Izzet identity if it is technically mono red but has a blue activated ability, and so forth. For this type of list, data doesn't play nearly as big of a role as it does in my videos on the best cards. Instead, the cards on this list are really just based on my own opinion. However, I do use a bit of data to help me select cards for a list like this. A card can't be considered one of the worst cards ever if it is widely played in EDH or if it has ever top-8'd a premier event. Most of the cards on this list also didn't usually make the cut in their respective limited formats either. In all, there are 237 cards with an Izzet identity, and in this video I'll give you my picks for the 10 worst ones ever. Let's get to the list. At number 10 I have Bloodfire Mentor. 3 mana 0/5s are basically never worth it, even in limited. Being able to block creatures forever just doesn't matter as much as you'd think. You need to actually be taking them down, or a creature like this is a very minor obstacle, since there's no actual danger for your opponent to attack into it. So you'd better do something good to justify inclusion in any deck, and looting for 3 mana isn't really it. I mean, it's an okay mana sink to have around, but when the body on it is pretty close to irrelevant, you shouldn't be interested in playing this. This manages to get the least bad card on the list award because it was at least kind of sort of playable and limited, but it was pretty much a D-level card there that you sort of hoped you weren't running. At number 9 I have Goblin Test Pilot. This 3 mana 0/2 flyer can tap to do 2 damage to any target, an ability that would be absolutely incredible if it weren't for the part where the target is chosen at random. Sure, when this goes your way, you're going to feel like you're doing a pretty good job, but it just won't go your way often enough to offset the downside of how random this is. Sometimes the ability won't do anything at all, like doing 2 damage to something with more than 2 toughness, and those situations won't be a disaster, but you know what will be? When the test pilot starts damaging you, or your planeswalkers or your creatures. It can even damage itself. The flavor here is definitely on point, since the idea is that the Goblin is not only an inept pilot, but he's also testing some sort of prototype that has some serious kinks to be worked out. Of all the cards on this list, this is the one that's the most widely played in EDH, and the few people who are playing it are definitely just doing it because random wacky effects like this can be fun in EDH. They aren't running it because it's good. At number 8, it is Dracoplasm. This gets my pick for the coolest card on this list, but being cool isn't really enough since you need your Magic cards to, actually help you win the game. Now, don't get me wrong, of all the cards on this list, it does have the highest ceiling. After all, it can become absolutely massive, and it has flying and fire breathing to go along with that. Problem is, it has to gobble up a bunch of creatures to gain their stats, and the payoff here just isn't going to be worth it most of the time. 9 times out of 10, just keeping the stats on the board across multiple bodies is better, especially because of the fact that you're putting all your eggs in one basket, and that means you're very vulnerable to a removal spell. So the ideal situation isn't even an especially good one for this card, as it takes a lot of setup and significant risk. The fail case is even worse, since it needs a substantial board to ever be relevant in the first place. If you don't have any other creatures in play, you just can't play Dracoplasm. If it was just a base 0/1 or something, you could at least play it on an empty board, and that would make it slightly better, but that's not how it works. Admire the art on this card and leave it in your binder. At number 7, it is Skiz Motivate. This is the kind of card that looks like it should do a whole lot, but it ends up not being useful far more often. Sure, it can help you do lethal if the +4/+0 is enough to kill your opponent, or fog a single creature that is attacking you, or be used to help a creature win combat, but all 3 of those scenarios are super specific, and even if it can do those things, it just won't most of the time. And when it does, you're usually going to be giving up a card to do it, not taking away a card from your opponent when you do it. Basically, it's either a really bad combat trick or a really bad fog, and neither of those things are that great to begin with. At number 6, it is Unnerving Assault, which has a similar problem to Skiz Motivate, but it is even more situational. If you spend both blue and red on it, you give your opponent's whole board -1/-0, and your whole board +1/+0. Even if it did both of those things all the time without the mana requirement, it still wouldn't be good. This is because there are way better ways to pump your whole board and way better ways to weaken your opponents, and like Skiz Motivate, situations won't happen very often where casting this will be worth a card. You'll just use it up to maybe save some creatures in combat, or do some extra damage. Very rarely will it let you actually kill something, letting you trade card for card with your opponent, and there isn't really a reason to play a card like that unless it has a powerful effect, and this just doesn't. At number 5, it is Noggle Bridgebreaker. A 4-mana 4/3 is kind of a reasonable stat line, but the downside here is big. Returning a land to your hand isn't really what you want to be doing, and I know people in the comments will be saying, but what about landfall? And my response to that is, yes, obviously this Noggle is better in a landfall deck, but you can abuse landfall in literally dozens of better ways. Playing a 4-mana 4/3 that lets you re-trigger landfall once isn't what you want to be doing, and outside of a landfall deck, this just sets you back a mana for a very minimal payoff. At number 4, it is Ember Wild Caliph. This creature has some super impressive stats, especially given that it was printed during a time where you just didn't get 4-mana 4/4 flyers. However, the downsides the Caliph comes with are massive. Attacking every turn isn't the biggest deal ever, but when it's combined with the fact that every time the Caliph does damage to something you lose that much life, you're looking at something pretty ugly. Sure, it does have flying and trample, meaning your opponent can't really chump it forever and kill you that way, but even just blocking a few times and letting it hit them a few times will be enough to kill you. The damage adds up in a hurry, and because it has to attack, it isn't like it can help you protect your life total either. You have to be really far ahead of your opponent for Ember Wild Caliph to do its thing, and if you're at parity or behind, there's a good chance it's going to lose you the game. At number 3, it is Talon Wren. A 5-mana 0/5 flyer is terrible, as once you're spending that much mana on something, it should be a pretty impactful card, but Talon Wren just isn't. Now, unlike the Bloodfire Mentor we saw earlier, Talon Wren can actually block and kill stuff sometimes, but only if you pump mana into it, and even when you do pump that mana in, you have to be careful to keep its toughness high enough that it can still effectively block or be blocked. That's right, the activated ability here isn't fire breathing straight up. The Talon Wren has to lower its toughness when it raises its power. In situations where your opponent can't block it at all, it does manage to threaten as much as 4 damage at a time, but only at a significant cost, while also lowering its toughness down to 1, making it vulnerable to all sorts of removal. And if you think about it, even if this had straight up fire breathing, it still wouldn't be very good, so giving it this watered down form of it really makes this card a worthless one. Also, in the art, Talon Wren is a super imposing looking creature, so this is definitely a flavor fail. What part of this creature's appearance makes it seem like it should have 0 power? Is it the razor sharp beak or the razor sharp talons? At number 2, it is Electric Eel. With Talon Wren, we saw a bad version of fire breathing, and we've also got that with Electric Eel, who also seems to have a little bit of Ember Wild Caliph going on too. The flavor here is neat, because the eel's electricity is so wild it even affects the card's controller. This is reflected in the damage the eel does to you when it enters the battlefield and when you activate its ability. If you have 2 red, you can make the eel a 3/1, but it also does damage to you. Even if the eel didn't also damage you every time it pumped its power, it still would not be very good. 2 red mana for +2/+0 isn't great, and this doesn't have any evasion to begin with. So most of the time, it'll just get blocked by a 1/1 or something, and the effect doesn't even matter. And sure, you can expend a bunch of resources and make it evasive one way or another, but even that just isn't worth it. Give evasion to an actually good creature instead. And at number 1, it is Petra Hydrox. This has Hill Giant stats, which is a pretty miserable starting point, so surely its text box is some kind of upside, right? Nope. Anytime this creature is targeted by anything, it goes right back to your hand. And sure, that does sort of mean it's immune to removal, since it turns it all into bounce spells, but it isn't like a 4-mana 3/3 is the kind of thing you have to worry about removing anyway. What's more is, if you try to target it with something like a combat trick or an aura to boost its anemic stats, that also leads to the Petra Hydrox getting bounced. So basically, you have a huge, inefficient creature with an ability that is more downside than upside. And yeah, it does cost hybrid mana, meaning it is easier to cast than most 2-colored cards, but that isn't anywhere near enough to save it from being my pick for the worst Izzet card we've ever seen. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you want to own any of these cards because, I don't know, maybe you like collecting garbage, you can find a link to the Card Kingdom store for each of them in the description. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on old MTG Top 10s, including more lists about the worst cards ever, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.